Good evening. Welcome to the Fanning the Flames speaker series, a celebration of our publication, Fanning the Flames, Propaganda in Modern Japan, published by Hoover Institution Press. I'm Kei Ueda, curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection at the Hoover Institution Library Archives and editor of the book. The book and the exhibition bring together scholarly essays and archival material from Hoover and detail the role of Japanese propaganda in fostering national identity and mobilizing participation in the country's transformation and wartime activities, beginning with the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 95 and continuing to the end of World War II. I'd like to thank my colleagues at Hoover Library Archives and the Hoover Press. Their exceptional teamwork made the publication and physical and online exhibition a beautiful production. We'd also like to thank the director of the Hoover Institution, Condoleezza Rice, for her support of the library and archives and our programs, and of course, the community of Hoover overseers and other supporters of the institution, without whom nothing we do would be possible. Also, as a curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection, supported by the endowed Japanese Diaspora Initiative, I would like to thank donors of archival material for helping us preserve and disseminate important chapters of Japanese and Japanese American histories for research and education. We continue to acquire archival material, and our recent acquisitions include material on Japanese American wartime linguists such as Tadashi Ogawa and Harry Fukuhara. As moderator for today's presentation, entitled Propaganda Leaflets Against the Japanese by the Allies, Inside Revelations and Japanese American Contributors, I'd like to mention, following Professor Reiko Tsuchiya's presentation, we'll briefly introduce our international collaborative digital project on propaganda leaflets with Waseda University. After that, we'll open up for Q&A. Please plan to enter your questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom window. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Professor Reiko Tsuchiya. Professor Tsuchiya received her Ph.D. in sociology from Hitotsubashi University, Japan, and has been a professor of sociology and media history in the Faculty of Political Science and Economics at Waseda University since 2010. She serves as director of the 20th Century Media Institute and editor-in-chief of the history journal Intelligence. Previously, she was a visiting scholar at the University of Maryland in 2003 and the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2017, as well as a visiting professor at Cairo University in Egypt in 2018 and the Communication University of China in 2013 to 15. She has numerous publications, including Chronology of Japanese Media History, an edited volume published in 2018, The Pacific War, Read from Propaganda Leaflets Against the Japanese in 2010, and The Origin of Popular Newspapers in Japan in 2002. She also created the database of wartime propaganda leaflets, which she will introduce in her talk. We are delighted to have her as a guest speaker to showcase her research on propaganda leaflets against the Japanese, including the papers of the head of the US Army Psychological Warfare Branch, Bonafranc Fellows, held in our collection. Now, please welcome Professor Tsuchiya.
So it is my great pleasure to speak at the Fanning the Frame speaker series presented by the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. At first, I have to thank Ms. Karl Yoneda, curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection at Hoover's Library and Archives, who gave me this opportunity to speak today for the series. If you will find my speech interesting, it is because of her and her team great help. So now I'm going to talk about my research on the propaganda leaflet in psychological warfare against Japan by Allied powers during the World War II. So as you may know, billions of leaflets were produced and distributed as the most important operation of psychological warfare, in addition to radio, in Asia and the Pacific by the Allied powers. The production of these leaflet and propaganda materials involved a large number of people from different languages, cultures, and ethnic backgrounds. As the subtitle suggests, Today, I would like to focus on Japanese Americans. Wartime propaganda can be divided into three main types, according to their target and purpose. The first type is a leaflet aimed at the enemy's army or civilians. The main purpose of it is to demoralize the enemy, to encourage surrender, and to comfort captured enemy soldiers. The second type of leaflet is aimed at the population of the area occupied by the enemy and at neutral countries. The main purpose is to call for non-cooperation with the enemy and to urge people to take refuge in the case of bombing. The third type of leaflet is aimed at soldiers and the civilians of the Allies who have fallen into the hands of the enemy with the aim of encouraging and consoling them. When we think of propaganda leaflet, we often think of those which depict the enemy as demons or devils or ferocious animals like a gorilla. Here are some examples. One from a front page of a Japanese magazine in 1944, a satirical picture of a President Roosevelt on the left. The other is a caricature on the right, is a caricature of the Japanese soldier quoted in John Dower's book, War Without Mercy in 1993. But this is the second type of propaganda. What am I going to talk about now is the first type, that is a leaflet which tries to persuade the enemy to surrender based on an understanding of the Japanese culture and the Japanese psyche. There is nothing in these that depicts the Japanese as monkeys or slanders them. So what kind of propaganda leaflet did the Allied forces produce against Japan? In the Pacific War, with the exception of China, it was the armies of three countries, Australia, the United States, and Britain, that waged the propaganda war against the Japanese. Australia and Britain had very few Japanese at the start of the war, very few peoples who could speak Japanese or understand Japanese culture, and there was no Japanese print. Although many Japanese Americans lived in the United States and newspapers and magazines were published in Japanese, at the outbreak of the war, Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps or restricted in their civilian lives. The Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI, the forerunner of the Office of the War Information, organized in June 1942, were the first to produce propaganda leaflet against Japan in the United States. But the ability of these Japanese Americans were not utilized. One of the first leaflets produced by COI in New York was the famous Kiri leaf. The leaflet was beautifully printed in color in the shape of leaves, but the language was old-fashioned and unintelligible to the average Japanese soldier. The OWI also made about 50 other propaganda leaflets, of which most famous one is this booklet called Unlucky Soldier, produced by a Japanese artist living in the United States called Taro Yashima, who was employed by OWI from June 1942. The booklet tells a story of a Japanese soldier from the countryside who dies in a battle, contrasting the emperor's hope for peace with the special service and warlords who profited from the war, and asks who took his life and used him as a springboard. This booklet, said to have been found in the pockets of many Japanese soldiers in China and other theaters, was highly praised. It is also interesting to note that its basic line on propaganda anticipated the political policy of the occupation, which was to hold the army and warlords responsible for the war without holding the emperor responsible. After Japan's defeat at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Allied propaganda against Japan began in earnest. Australian and British forces began to produce propaganda leaflets in Japanese using non-Japanese who could speak Japanese in their respective war theaters. This leaflet was produced by the Far Eastern Liaison Office in Brisbane. As there was no Japanese typeset, it was written by Charles Babbage, who was born and brought up in Japan and had a Swiss father. The leaflet was produced by the British Far Eastern Bureau in New Delhi. The pictures were painted by an English woman called Marjorie Biddle, who was the first wife of a Japanese famous poet, Junzaburo Nishiwaki, and the text was probably written by a Korean who had studied in Japan. However, the First Eastern Bureau of UK recognized that the propaganda against Japan was problematic in terms of both quality and quantity, and sought out Japanese people in the United States who had a good knowledge of English. As a result, Shigeki Oka, Oka Shigeki, was chosen as a candidate. Oka Shigeki was born in 1878 in Aki City, Kochi Prefecture in Japan, and became a reporter for Yorozu Choho newspaper run by his cousin, Kuroiwa Reiko. However, he left the paper after beating up a senior reporter and went to the United States. This is a photograph taken in 1902, just before he came to America. He was 24 years old. His journey to the United States seemed to have been aided by a network of socialists. And in San Francisco, he organized the Japanese Socialist Revolutionary Party with Kotoku Shusui, who had come to the United States in 1905. While under the scrutiny of the Japanese government as a socialist, he published an American and other Japanese newspapers in Los Angeles and San Francisco, like this. And he was married and brought up to the two children. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Oka had sent a letter to the President Roosevelt, pledging his allegiance to the United States and offering to supply his types, Japanese types of his printing press, if it would help. Anti-war, anti-fascist, and anti-warlord were his arguments. It was November 1942 that the State Department official came to Oka, who had been relocated to a camp on the Hart Mountain in Wyoming. Initially, Oka was asked to sell his Japanese typesetting and printing presses, but he replied, "I don't want to sell them, but I can lend them to you for 2 years at $125 a month." The reason, he thought, was that this war would be over in 2 years. He ran a printing house called the Kinmon Press, and this is a photograph of his printing press and type. He gathered a total of 8 Japanese collaborators from the camps, including a translator, typographer, and a broadcaster, and headed for India. He was not told the detail of the job, but Oka had a rough idea. Oka was 64 years old at that time. About a year later, they arrived in India, but the British and Indian troops were so vigilant at first, they were not allowed any freedom of action. A typical leaflet they produced in Calcutta was a propaganda leaflet in the style of newspaper, entitled Military Newspaper, Gunjin Shimbun. This was a tabloid size and had only 2 pages on the front and back, but it may have been similar to the general newspaper in Japan at the time, which were reduced to 2 or 4 pages due to the shortage of paper. The leaflet carried a wide range of articles from the war situation to the domestic situation in Japan, but only factual news and did not contain any conspiracy propaganda falsehood. The objectives and calm writing style of the leaflet, which erased any expressions of contempt or ridicule, was highly praised even by the Japanese general staff who obtained and read it. As the weekly Gunjin Shimbun, military newspaper, was being read by the Japanese soldiers, in December 1944, a 4-page photo-centered leaflet entitled Gunjin Gaho, Military Campaign Picture, began to be produced on a weekly basis. Indeed, 2 series of leaflets were welcomed by information-hungry Japanese prisoners of war, remained in production until December 1945, after the war had ended. In addition to these newspaper leaflets, Oka and his colleague also produced general propaganda leaflets showing a high level of skill in their printing and design. This leaflet is an example. Although some felt that the British leaflets they made were rather repugnant because they exploited their weakness too much and reminded them of the leaflet of the socialist movement. However, the Japanese leaflet produced by Oka and his colleagues had a great influence on the production of leaflets in other war theaters. After the war, Oka continued to work on the World Weekly, the Japanese language newspaper of the Southeast Asian Command, and returned to the United States in January 1946. Oka reopened his printing house in San Francisco, where he died in 1959 at the age of 80. This is a photograph of his shop and of Oka when he returned to Kochi in 1950. Oka's success as the first of the Japanese Americans to contribute to Allied propaganda against Japan set a precedent for the subsequent appointments of Japanese Americans. In October 1943, the OWI switched to the producing leaflet at overseas locations. It was the OWI branch in Redo of Assam, India, which first started producing Japanese propaganda leaflets in November 1943. In April 1944, 9 Nisei American soldiers, graduates of the United States Army Intelligence Intelligence School at Camp Savage, Minnesota, arrived at the OWI-led branch. In this photo, you can see Karl Yoneda and Kenji Yasui and Sam Sasaki, the Nisei, and their participation in the psychological operation was still a military secret. Karl Yoneda was a key figure in the writing of these leaflets on the Indo-Burma-China front. He was born in California in USA in 1906, the second son of a Japanese couple. At the age of 7, he went to Japan, where he studied until 17 years old in Hiroshima. After dropping out of his high school in 1923, he took part in student movements and labor movements. And in 1924, he was arrested for taking part in a strike of printers in Tokyo and Osaka. He escaped the draft and moved to Los Angeles in 1926, where he joined the Communist Party. In 1933, he moved to San Francisco, where he became editor-in-chief of the Labor News. At the outbreak of war, he and his wife, Elaine, were forced to move to the Manzana camp in 1942. In the same year, he volunteered for the Army Intelligence Language School in Minnesota to join the psychological warfare. After the war, he became involved in labor issues and the human rights movement. compiling a history of Japanese workers in the United States. In 1983, he published Ganbatte, 60 Years Struggle of a Kibei Worker. But his most important work in terms of propaganda came in 1989 with the publication of the Diary of an American Intelligence Soldier, published in 1989. In the book, he described in detail the leaflet making in Assam at the time. This is a leaflet, the first surrender leaflet he wrote, entitled "Alive is the Yamato Cherry Blossom." A surrender leaflet is a leaflet that encourages soldiers to surrender, stating that they will not be attacked if they surrender with waving the leaflet as a white flag. The leaflet states in Japanese, English, and Chinese that soldiers who surrender will be treated with respect. This type of leaflet is the most important of all the leaflets used in the battle and has a unique function of propaganda leaflets. This is another leaflet he wrote, using actual letters of thanks from captured Japanese soldiers. It describes how the care and kindness he had received as a POW had changed his view of the Americans, whom he had been told to regard as a devils and brats. In April 1945, the Assam Psychological Warfare Group, including Karl Yoneda, moved to Kunming, China. There, they also produced leaflets such as this one. The leaflet is like a season's greeting card, calling out to the Japanese army. Soldiers, the cherry blossoms have bloomed beautifully again this year, in keeping with the Japanese custom of the cherry blossoms viewing season. The inclusion of Japanese Americans probably made this expression possible. The Bonafela's collection, housed in the Hoover Institution Library and Archives, contains leaflets and documents produced by the Psychological Warfare Division of General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Theater Command. This command, Psychological Warfare Division at GHQ, was in full swing in Brisbane from June 1944. The central figure in the creation of the Psychological Warfare Department was Brigadier General Bonafela's, who had been appointed MacArthur's immediate secretary. He had a deep understanding of the Japanese military and psychological warfare, and having served briefly in the OSS, set the course of operations for psychological warfare against Japan leading up to the occupation. In this picture, you can see he is on the light side. In the summer of 1944, in anticipation of the campaign to retake the Philippines, Don Brown, a former reporter for the Japan Advertiser who had spent some time in Tokyo, was called in to produce propaganda leaflet against the Japanese like this. Title is, "Time is Running Out." On the clock, the islands where American troops had advanced are depicted, and the broken flag of the rising sun represents the defeat of Japanese troops. The current long hands point to Okinawa, meaning that the Battle of Okinawa is being fought and that the Japanese mainland is due to be attacked next. It is a well-designed leaflet. This was a common design for surrender leaflet used in Southwest Pacific Theater. The words, "I cease resistance," are written in large letters with vertical red and blue lines. This phrase, "I cease resistance," was used in recognition of the shame of surrendering for Japanese soldiers. Blindfolds were placed over the face of the POWs in pictures used in the photographs so that they could not be identified. This was also because Americans had learned from interrogations of Japanese prisoners of war that if a soldier was found to be a prisoner of war, he would be treated coldly in the village where his family lived. By learning more about Japanese mind and the Japanese society behind, American soldiers were able to develop propaganda that would move the Japanese people. Nisei soldiers and Japanese prisoners of war were also involved in the production of these leaflets in this war theater. At the same time, leaflets began to be produced in Honolulu in conjunction with OWI and Navy. Although there were many people of Japanese descent in Hawaii, the military did not allow them to be employed until October 1944, when 10 Japanese Americans were employed as Japanese language officers. This photo shows a Japanese American, Seiko Ogai, arranging Japanese propaganda leaflets. This is one of the leaflets she handled in the picture on the table. It asks, "It is all right if Japan became the country only of old people, women, and children." The artist who painted this characteristic picture was Francis Bacon on the left, who had lived in Tokyo for about 5 years. She painted the Japanese people, Japanese landscapes, and customs in the propaganda leaflet with her unique brushstrokes. Although there were many Japanese newspapers published in Hawaii, the use of Japanese type on leaflet was slow in coming. From September 1944, Japanese language leaflets in forms of newspaper were published on a weekly basis and were named Makoto and then Hawaii Weekly. From June 1945, the Mariana Times was produced, with Japanese prisoners of war taking part in its production. It is noteworthy that almost identical leaflets in form of Korean language newspaper were also produced. It is assumed that Korean living in Hawaii helped to create it. When the island of Saipan fell in June 1944, it became the base for the psychological warfare against Japan. Large quantity of leaflets were produced and began to be dispersed throughout Okinawa and mainland. In particular, during the Battle of Okinawa, which began in late March 1945, some 8 million leaflets were distributed over a period of about 3 months until the end of the battle in early July. These are leaflets that were distributed in Okinawa. The leaflet on the left said that the US military is your friend. This is a phrase typical of this type of leaflet. The leaflet on the right, showing the front and back, was a leaflet encouraging people to surrender and was titled "A Leaflet to Save Lives." Air raids on the mainland began, and by August 1945, more than 70 million leaflets had been sworn across the Japanese archipelago. In parallel with issuing the Potsdam Declaration and forcing Japan to surrender, the Allies conducted psychological warfare using a combination of leaflet and air raids. These leaflets, with the names of cities for potential air raid targets, were distributed for warnings, and air raids were actually carried out a few days later. This was to encourage people to evacuate and reduce the damage. But no leaflet of this kind was sworn before the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After the war, when the occupation forces studied the effect of the leaflet, they found that the leaflet warning of air raid has a great influence on the Japanese people, who had been taught not to believe the leaflet because they were a plot by the enemy to believe the Allied leaflets. Propaganda leaflets by Allied powers informed the Japanese people of the truth before the Japanese media did. For example, It was through leaflets by the Allies that the Japanese people were first informed of the contents of Potsdam Declaration and its acceptance by the Japanese government. It became known toward the end of the war that many Japanese Americans were involved in the production of these propaganda leaflets. However, in principle, it is not stated who produced the propaganda leaflet during the war. It was not until more than 20 years after the war that activities of Shigeki Oka and Karl Yoneda, who were involved in psychological warfare, were published in books. I have been interested in these propaganda leaflets since 2003 and published such a book in 2011, based on my research into the actual leaflets and their related documents. From point of view for media history, these leaflets are important to know not only actual propaganda operated in Asia and the Pacific, but also one of the origins for mass communication and media studies, because the basic theory and procedure of a propaganda leaflet operation for American Army were established through this war, and we can see their application in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and even in the Iraq War. In March last year, I published a database of the textbook about 1,500 different propaganda leaflets against Japan during the Pacific War. Thanks to the effort of Ms. Ueda, the database has been linked to the Hoover Institution Archives and the leaflet from the Bonafella collection, together with the Japanese and English text, have been beautifully designed and are now available on the web. I hope that you will be able to see the efforts of those who, despite the horrors of war, try to bring about peace by understanding of the Japanese people and their culture, and by reaching out to their hearts. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you, Professor Tsuchiya. Before we open up the Q&A, we'd like to give the audience a sneak preview of a new addition to our online digital exhibition, which incorporates Professor Tsuchiya's research on propaganda leaflets and Hoover's archival collection of Bonafellas. The actual site will be open and become available next week. My colleague Marisa Ree would navigate the online exhibition for us. It's a new digital story of the Fanning the Flames online exhibition showcasing our international collaborative project. We begin the introduction with Bonafellas, the head of psychological warfare branch. We aim to combine the transcription data and Professor Tsuchiya's analysis of propaganda leaflets with our leaflet images and English explanation from the fellows' papers. You can see two digital collections, Wartime Propaganda Leaflets database that Professor Tsuchiya has explained, and our new beta digital collection that hosts many of the leaflets from the fellows' papers. In this digital story, we highlight 9 leaflets. The first leaflet provides distribution instructions in English and Visayan for the people in the central Philippines. We find this leaflet particularly fascinating because it incorporates other leaflets in the fellows' papers in its design. You can explore each leaflet by clicking on the leaflet number in blue. By scrolling down, you can discover the full text and accompanying documents from the fellows' papers. Thanks to the transcriptions from Professor Tsuchiya's database and Hoover, all the text is fully searchable by pressing Ctrl F. The digital story and database are completely open access. We hope you explore them. Thank you, Marisa and Hoover's exhibition team and Professor Tsuchiya for their work on this exhibition. As we open up for Q&A, please remember to use the Q&A function of the Zoom window. Also note, while Professor Tsuchiya's presentation was given in English, she'll provide her answers mostly in Japanese for Q&A. I will try my best to bring the 2 languages. We thank you in advance for your patience as we may need time in providing answers. So I'd like to begin with the first question. First question was, wasn't the US Army concerned about recruiting socialists for the propaganda campaign?
これに対する答えというのはですね、日本の政府で、共産主義者または社会主義者として、チェックされていた人物というのを、そういう経歴をアメリカの政府自体は知っていたわけですけれども、しかしながら、日本と戦うときに、そういった経歴というのは、それほど、問題にはならなかったと思われます。なぜなら、その時に、やはり、日本人、日系人は、それだけで適正国人というふうに見なされていたので、そして、かなり多くの人々の日系人が日本を支持する。日本側につくっていうような恐れがあったので、その中で、反ファシズム、反軍閥を主張するような、社会主義者、共産主義者っていうのは、敵の敵は味方という形で、採用したのは合理的だったんじゃないかと思います。それは戦後の冷戦期に、社会主義者や、共産主義者が、敵視されて追われるようになった時期ではまだなかったということもあると思います。
Okay, so during the war against Japan, the US government, such as the State Department, had relatively good Japanese American data. I believe what was important for the US government was recruiting individuals who are anti-war and anti-fascist, showed no hesitation for Japan's defeat, and pledged their allegiance to the United States. Being a socialist or not was not a major issue for the US. Later, after 1948, the post-war and Cold War structure became more apparent. The US regarded socialists and communists as threats. However, during World War II, being Japanese raised the issue of enemy aliens, therefore recruiting socialists and communists that the Japanese government regarded as dangerous was probably reasonable. Like the enemy of my enemy is my ally. So the next question is, MacArthur and the Office of Strategic Services did not necessarily get along, as I understand. And did these internal differences create regional variabilities in the US propaganda campaigns against the Japanese?
マッカーサーが、自分の西南大西洋、戦域で、OSS を用いなかったっていうことはよく知られています。排除したんですね。でもそれは結果的には良かったことじゃないかと思います。内部的に問題があったかというと、そんなに問題はなかったんじゃないかと思います。なぜなら、マッカーサーが OSS を追い出したのは、やはり戦域プロパガンダを、統一して支配したかったからだと思うんですね。そのためにボナフェラーズが組織した心理戦組織はほとんど軍人中心で、作られ、構成されました。そのことによって、戦闘プロパガンダ、つまり戦場でのプロパガンダは作戦とリンクしてうまく機能したと思います。そしてもう一つ、指摘しておかなければならないのは、オーストラリア軍や英国軍と協力して情報交換をしなければいけなかったんですけれども、OSS に相当するような機関が他の、軍のところにはある、他の国の組織にはなくてですね、むしろ、アメリカ特有の組織だったという部分があると思います。もちろんインテリジェンス組織はあったわけですけれども、OSS はまだ完全にインテリジェンス組織になっていなくて、ブラックプロパガンダを主としていた組織でしたので、その辺が、やはりマッカーサーとしては問題だと思っていたと思います。ですので、それがプロパガンダ自体の問題に、何か希弱性問題になったか弱点になったかというと、弱点にはならなくて、むしろそれが正解だったというふうに私は思います。
So it is a known fact that MacArthur did not allow the OAS or the Office of Strategic Services to operate in the territories under his control Instead, I believe he intended to place the entire Pacific theater under his control. When he established his general headquarters psychological warfare branch, Boniface understood his intention and organized the branch to be made up almost exclusively of military men. A single streamlined chain of command probably created close link between battles and propaganda campaigns, which was the ideal situation for psychological warfare. It also made it easier to work with the British and Australian forces because they did not have separate propaganda organizations like the US, the OAS and Office of War Information of the United States. Also, OAS was not a yet intelligence organization at that time. Therefore, in my opinion, MacArthur's decisions to exclude the OAS served the overall purpose positively. So the next question is Stephen Schreier. Did Japanese propaganda leaflets get into the United States in large quantities?
あまりたくさん米国本土にはまかれていないと思います。ただし、フィリピンですね、当時、アメリカ軍が支配していた、フィリピンとか、それからオーストラリアとかニューギニアとかですね、いろんなところにはたくさんまかれました。一番日本軍が、戦線を拡大した島々には、まかれました。けれども、多分ハワイとかにもあまりまかれていないと思いますね。
So, not many leaflets have reached the mainland United States. There were many distributed in the Philippines, Australia, and New Guinea, where Japanese army was present. I don't think there are many leaflets distributed even to Hawaii. So the next question is, in one leaflet this is from Mindy Kotler. In one leaflet, a Japanese woman in kimono was dancing under the cherry blossoms. She had a short hair with bangs. It is my understanding that the bangs for females, other than little girls, meant that they were prostitutes. Do you think this was the intended message of the picture? If so, why?
多分、これは少女の絵だと思いますね。売春婦っていうか、娼婦を描いたんじゃなくて、これはやっぱり少女の絵じゃないかなというふうに私は思っています。はい。
I understand this picture as being a depiction of a girl instead of a prostitute. So the next question is from Joseph Kao. Why you use the word against Japan? Do you rather have bombs dropped? Do you rather to have the bombs dropped? Japanese invaded China, US, and many Asian countries. Shouldn't they fight back? Using leaflet is a better way to fight than with the bullets. Do you agree?
まず、against Japan っていうのは、これはもともとその米国軍、連合国軍の、心理戦の中でそのまま用いられているんです。ですので、特に私が特別にそういうふうに表現したというよりは、もともとの資料がそのように、心理戦の中で、against Japan というふうに言っているのですね。
So the word against Japan was directly taken from the Allies. It was not my invention or description per se.
後半の方はこれは何と答えたもんでしょう。
Is a better way to fight than with the bullets. Do you agree?
やっぱり戦争の場合は第一にやっぱり攻撃というのがあって、そして、ビラとか宣伝というのは、それに付随する第二だということですね。これはやはり、もちろん爆弾を落としたりする前に、避難せよというようなビラを撒いたりはしますけれども、基本的に、戦いとしてはやはり、物理的な 破壊戦というのが主であって、心理戦は銃ですね。
So, in my opinion, wars are the principle of wars is first battles or destruction, followed by propaganda or psychological war. There are times when, before the bombs were dropped, leaflets were distributed to urge evacuation, but the propaganda campaign is secondary in this, is an accompanying element of the wars, in my opinion. Question from Yolanda Tsuda. I'm from the Philippines and a long-time resident of Japan, and currently doing the oral historical project of a Filipina who was a member of the Japanese military propaganda unit during World War II, going all over the Philippines for pro-Japanese propaganda. She was married to a Philippine-born Japanese and subsequently became Hikiagesha in 1946 to Osaka. Many of the members of the Japanese military propaganda unit in the Philippines were well-known Japanese intellectuals, writers, and other cultural workers and entertainers. In the groups that you discussed who were involved in making anti-Japanese propaganda, were there also well-known intellectuals, writers, cultural workers among the groups in India or elsewhere?
はい、ありがとうございます。フィリピンで、日本側の、宣伝に、加わったっていう方がいらっしゃるっていうことで、直接、お話を伺えてありがとうございます。それで、日本側の、ごめんなさい、日本に対しての、プロパガンダを、行った中で有名な人たちがいますかということですけども、フィリピンということでしょうかね。それとも、インドとかも全部含めてっていうことなんでしょうかね。
これはインドとかのことが中心のようです。
そうですね。プロパガンダのそのビラを直接作ったかどうかということについて言うと、多分いないわけではないんですけれども、むしろ有名な人としては、例えばこの翻訳とか通訳に関わった人がやはり多いと思いますね。例えばドナルド・キーンとかですね。ドナルド・キーンはよく知られているように、この語学将校の一人で、そして日本人の日本兵士が、常時携えていた日記というのを拾い集めて、心理戦に使うために翻訳してたんですけれども、その翻訳の役目から、日本文学研究者になった。これは彼は代表的な一人ですね。ただ、彼が直接プロパガンダのビラを作ったわけではないので、そういう意味では間接的だと思いますね。そういう人が代表的で、他にも、何人か、それほど有名でないっていう方たちもいますけれども、それが一つの例としてご紹介できるかなと思います。
So as far as I know, there was more translators who became well known, such as Donald Keene, who was a linguist officer, and he was translating captured Japanese diaries into English. And he later became a Japanese literature scholar. And so although he was not directly involved in propaganda campaign per se, but he was translator and he became a very well-known figure. The other questions are, let me see. Did radio broadcaster Tokyo Rose have any leaflets?
それはなかったと思いますね。ただし、東京の放送を宣伝するというビラは撒いたようですけれど、東京ローズというような形で、彼女が直接出てくるような形のビラはなかったと思います。
それラジオ東京のが放送するというビラですか？
そういう意味ですね。
はい。Okay. So I don't think there was any leaflet that featured Tokyo Rose. There were leaflets that promoted or they announced the broadcasting of Tokyo, Radio Tokyo, but not featuring Tokyo Rose per se. Let me see, what are the other questions? We got quite a few questions that are coming in. Question from Tokiko Basel. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk and introduction of the informative Waseda database. The database does not provide actual leaflet images. Are you planning to post the images as well for the future, or do you have such a plan?
ありがとうございます。そう、画像を入れたいんですよね。それで、私も画像をたくさん持ってはいるんですけれど、あちらこちらの、図書館とか、アーカイブの、写真を撮って持ってきてはいるんですけれども、それを、公開するために協力してもらわなければいけないんですけれど、それをどうやって撮ったらいいのか、無償で公開している分には大丈夫なのかとか、著作権はないと思うんですけれども、若干アーカイブとの関係でどうしたものかなと思って、ちょっと、考えているという最中です。もし、アーカイブの方のですね、協力が得られれば、ぜひ、そのような公開はしたいと思っています。
We like to incorporate images that I have quite a few images that are taken from various archives, but the question is we need to get a permission from them, and we like, we love to collaborate with them if possible. Almost out of time. Maybe one more question. Question from Yu Wu. Is there any case to show the results of the leaflets?
これはもうたくさんあってですね、どういうふうにこのリーフレットの結果っていうのを評価するかっていうのは、連合国軍側の心理戦部の大問題で、方法は主に3つあったというふうに考えられています。1つは、捕虜を尋問して、その尋問の中でどういうビラを見たのか、それにどういう影響を受けたのかっていうようなことを、話を聞く。これが1つですね。それから先ほど日記を拾うっていう話をしましたけど、当時の日本人の兵士はみんな日記を、手帳みたいなものにつけるっていうことを訓練づけられていたので、その日記の中に、ビラの記載があるかどうかっていうのを、資料を集めて、それで評価するっていうのが2つ目ですね。で、3つ目は捕虜の数っていうことで非常に単純なんですけど、捕虜自体はいろんな状況によって、単にビラを見たから、拾ったからっていうだけではなくて、いろんな戦況やなんかの状況に影響されて出てくるので、それはちょっと難しいかなと思うんですけれども、そういうことで、連合国軍の方は、様々な評価をしていました。で、ビラが、非常に大きな影響を与えた例としては、ちょっと今島の名前忘れたんですけれども、オーストラリアの、北の方にある、ニューギニアの、近くのところの島で、このビラを、戦闘の後ですかね、に巻いたところ、そのリーダーが、投稿してきたっていうの、リーダーとともに、何十人でしたっけね、かなり100人近くの兵士が投稿してきたっていうのがありましたね。いろいろな例がもうレポートされているんですけれども、それをいちいち心理戦部の方でやっぱり報告してまとめています。これはものすごい記録があります。
So, the question of evaluating the results of the leaflets, it was a major concern of the Allies. There were many cases that were reported, and they evaluated, assessed them very closely. Mostly, there are principally 3 ways to evaluate the effects. One is the interrogate the POWs and then ask them if they have actually seen the leaflets and so forth. The second one is the review the captured diaries. Japanese soldiers were trained to sort of jot down and keep journals. So these captured journals, if they have a description of leaflets and if they have read these leaflets. The third one is a little bit more problematic, the number of POWs, because it depends on many other factors other than the propaganda leaflets. So, but those are the three main criteria to evaluate the effects. There was a major, I guess, impact of the leaflets, propaganda leaflets that was reported near New Guinea after the battle. The leader, as well as about 100 soldiers, was surrendered after the battle, after having read the leaflet. I think we are at the time, close to the end of the time. So Professor Tsuchiya, thank you very much for your wonderful and inspiring talk and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your great help. And thank you for listening, everyone.
So, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Please remember to visit our Fanning the Flames online exhibition, which includes a new collaborative digital story, the website address, as well as the information about the Fanning the Flames publication is on the screen. We hope you enjoyed today's event, and our next speaker series talk is titled Missionaries and Nisei as quote-unquote informants for the Civil Affairs Training School at Stanford University in 1944 to 1945 by Professor Kayoko Takeda. We look forward to seeing you again on February 18th. Thank you.